Turned them on, okay. Good morning, everyone.
The energy is awesome.
So we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, just on behalf of the Hub and the MacArthur Foundation, just want to say thank you for your energy, your excitement, and we're getting really good feedback from yesterday's events, and just excited about today and tomorrow as well. So we're going to go ahead and begin with our plenary panel this morning. And we're really excited about just a collection of talent and experience and commitment to really working with and empowering young people in their local communities that's represented here on the panel today. And each one's going to introduce themselves, so I won't do that. But let me just say that their work has been really critical, I think, in terms of understanding just the shifting contours of young people's social, civic, political, and digital lives. And so there's just sort of great anticipation for their willingness to share their stories, to share their expertise, their insights in terms of the work that they've been doing. We named this panel Remixing Citizenship and Remaking Democracy, because we think in so many respects the work that's represented here, and certainly the work that many of you are doing, is kind of a catalyst for how we begin to think about the ways in which new notions of social, civic, and political engagement are beginning to emerge, and how that's being expressed in a variety of different ways, some of which Ethan alluded to quite eloquently yesterday. But we see remix as a form of making, remix as a form of doing, and importantly, I think remix as a source and a form of agency. And so in that sense, beginning to think about the ways in which notions of citizenship are being remade, how they're being kind of recontextualized, rearticulated, and creating new pathways and possibilities for how young people participate in their communities and lives around them. And so a lot of what we're going to hear today is just experts and insights and opportunities to share really important and powerful experiences and stories that begin to give some concrete kind of evidence to the kinds of shifts and changes that are taking place. So before we start, we actually wanted to open up with an announcement that was brought to us by Creative Commons, and I think we have a slide just to help us out with this. So this is Basil Carterville, who's a volunteer for Creative Commons, and over the last year or so, he's been held captive in Syria. And I think there's a campaign that's being launched today and a variety of activities happening online and offline. And we have a friend of ours here who wanted to say a little bit about this work.
Thank you. Today, this person, Basil Carterville, this is the 1-year anniversary of his being held in Syria. And so in many ways, and going back to the story that Craig told yesterday about the Egyptian who was held and detained, this is a story of another open internet activist who is being held. He's being held in a Syrian prison. He has been held without charges. He has been held without legal representation. The open internet community is calling upon everyone to please to highlight this. So I have just this one slide, one story, and one ask of everyone here in this room. Basil is an open source coder. He is the lead of Creative Commons Syria. He's a member of the Mozilla community. He's a contributor to Wikipedia, and he's being held in Syria. He believes in the open internet. And for over 10 years, he has been using the open technologies and open internet to improve the life of Syrians, to educate people about online media, and to teach people about open source tools. So he has been an important part of that community. When we all gather here as part of a community, I think this is a very stark reminder that while our work is critically important, and yet, as we work here in Chicago and other people work around the world, that real lives in many parts of the world hang in the balance when they promote the open internet. Basil's imprisonment is really a reminder that we're part of a larger global ecosystem. I want to call out that Foreign Policy magazine has ranked him number 19 of 100 top global thinkers. Just a few weeks ago, the Index of Censorship has announced and nominated him for the Digital Freedom Award. And what my ask is for everyone who has a community and you have a network behind you to please raise awareness, to use the hashtag FreeBasel, to call out to your community, to make the community aware. There are gatherings, as Craig mentioned, across the world today. And I just want to end with just a short quote. I did write a piece for the Huffington Post. It got published this morning to raise awareness about Basel, to call for freeing Basel as we call to free culture around the world. When change comes to Syria, it won't be because one side finally defeated another. It will be thanks to Basel and to people like him who have used his creativity and intelligence to find new solutions. When Basel is free, he will rejoin our community, and he will build a better Syria, and he will build a freer world. Please raise awareness, hashtag FreeBasel. Thank you very much.
I just wanted to offer, if anyone is interested in taking action tonight for the Free Basel campaign, we're meeting in the lobby at 6 p.m. and postering downtown Chicago with some Free Basel posters, writing and tweeting about the event. So join us at 6 p.m. in the lobby downstairs.
Okay, thank you. So the way we decided to do this is to have each member of the panel introduce themselves and tell a little bit about who they are, kind of some of the work that they're doing, and how kind of their vision for the world in many respects kind of connects to some of the thematic ideas and vision for this conference. So I think we're going to begin with Cathy.
No.
I'm sorry, with Danah.
I got this stick to go first. So hi, my name is Danah Boyd, and many of you in this room know me for my research. I have a bunch of different affiliations, but I identify myself as an activist, as an academic, and as an advocate for young people. My associations at this point primarily is Microsoft Research, which is the academic division of Microsoft. I also have a faculty appointment at NYU, and I'm a part of the fellow community at Berkman. But beyond the research that I do really on young people, I've spent a lot of my life trying to figure out how to use different aspects of technology to really organize and connect activists who have been really passionate about changing the world. So for 8 years, I worked for an organization called V-Day, which is known best for the Vagina Monologues, helping build out online communities to connect people. So it's been really fun to watch all of the different possibilities of using new technologies to think about how to make meaningful connections. Because a lot of what I'm really passionate about is bringing together constituencies who do not normally come together, right? We can think about researchers with technologists, with policymakers, with different kinds of activists, with publics. And I know that's a passion for many people in the room. For me as a researcher, I think a lot about some of the sort of doom and gloom topics of what happens when we deal with young people and some of the darker sides of their experiences. So my projects these days are really focused on things like meanness and cruelty, often formed in the ideas of bullying, a lot of issues about privacy and what it means to deal with the issues of data privacy and social privacy. And probably the darkest project I'm working on right now has to do with the commercial sexual exploitation of children, otherwise publicly talked about as human trafficking. So I look at a lot of what happens within the realm of social media as these great opportunities, both to raise awareness of what's going on, but also to complicate the kinds of networks and connections. And one of the things that keeps coming up in a lot of my work is, when does it make sense to raise visibility? When does actually making things more visible help people? And when does it create unintended consequences that we haven't necessarily thought through? And part of what I'm going to sort of throw out here, and Craig had asked us to give sort of one topic or one project that helps us think through things. And I'm going to give a project that's actually not one of my own, but one that I've been thinking a lot about because it really challenges some of these issues. And that's the project of the It Gets Better campaign. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. I'm guessing many of you are. But it was started as, in many ways, an awareness campaign and a way of speaking to young people from adults originally, trying to encourage them to be aware of the idea that being queer as a young person, it will eventually get better. And of course, there's a lot of rumblings that happen of like, well, I want to make it better now, and these kinds of tensions that emerge. But what I want to highlight is the challenge that emerged when young people started to actually create It Gets Better videos themselves. Now, most of the It Gets Better video campaigns made by young people were made by LGBT-identified young people, some of whom were out, some of whom were not. They make these videos that were really passionate about what it meant to be queer within their particular community. And on one hand, you'd see these videos and they were really exciting because you saw these young people telling, really exciting stories about how they were accepted or what they did to make something work in their community. But you also saw a lot of videos from young people who were clearly and painfully hurting. Videos of their attempts to first come out, videos that were literally their first coming out activity. And one of the things I started noticing, which scared me, and I've been going back and forth with the Trevor Project on this, were that some of these videos were made by young people who then went on to die by suicide. And it started creating this question of what's going on. And as I started talking to a bunch of young people, I started hearing a similar kind of story, which is that young people would make these videos hoping that the process of making that video would make it better for them within their community, only to find out that making this video, while they were part of a social movement, they were not actually connected emotionally and personally to it. So their video became part of a movement, but they themselves, as embodied actors, did not become a part of that movement. And in fact, their embodied experiences were back in school, where they then would get more torment and more harassment and more anti-queer activities and more homophobic messages. And it becomes this challenge of what does it mean to participate in these very big public social movements? And if we think about what Ethan talked about yesterday, this sort of tensions around thin and thick, the tensions around symbolic and impactful, one of the challenges of this campaign is that for so many young people, it was a symbolic move that ended up having a really negative impact on their lives. It was a participation that they thought of as a way of really deeply engaging, a thick participation, but when it was consumed in a thin way. How do you deal with these different tensions? And I started to realize something really important. And Connie Yao and I spent a lot of time over the last year trying to think through how different kinds of social movements can work. And one of the things that we spent a lot of time realizing was that in order to empower youth, you actually need to make certain that youth are first safe, that they have networks and communities that will support them. So when they're coming out, they're really engaging in social movement activities. They've got people to turn to that will support them. The second thing is that they have skills, that they actually feel as though they can do things that make sense. And of course, there's skill building in the process of a lot of what we talk about, but really feeling, again, connected to it. And then we can talk about the opportunities that sort of emerge from that. And so I guess the big takeaway that I sort of want to leave you and that we'll get into a conversation about is how important it is to think not just necessarily immediately going to the idea of participation, because participation can often be really valuable, but when is participation not really a realistic first step when you need to make certain that young people have the infrastructure, the support, the networks to make certain that they're grounded to actually be the kind of civic actors that we want them to be?
I think before Cathy speaks, Cathy comes to us wearing many different hats, as do many of our panelists do. We wanted just to show a quick video of a recent project that Cathy helped to create here in Chicago called the Black Youth Project. And I mentioned yesterday young Chicagoans who launched an online petition that ended up urging the president to come here and speak directly to them about some of the issues facing them. It was my understanding that after he came here, he actually met with some of the students privately, and Cathy's work with some of those students was really a part of that. So we wanted to show you, just to introduce you to some of that work that she's been doing.
I am 6,935 days old. I am 19.
The Black Youth Project is really cool because it's a space where people from various communities can come together and get information.
Finally, there's a place on the web where young Black people can speak for themselves.
My words, no.
It's the bridging of the gap between academic tools, and so youth can learn about the data sets that are out there about us.
You can get information from the rap lyrics database.
You can find a whole number of videos as well as articles and blogs that talk about hip-hop in a way that respects young Black people.
It is a place where the perspectives of young Black people will be heard loud and clear.
On the beaten backs of books that I was never supposed to read.
Too often we hear of the extremes, either those that have made it or really the millions of young people who are incarcerated, who find themselves in failing schools.
I'm sorry to say, your best friend is gone. Now you know why I don't pick up the phone.
And we can actually talk about things that matter to us.
A lot of youth have something to say now. We understand now, and we want our voices heard now. And at the forefront of every civil rights movement, every war, every story that your grandmother spoke words and told, there is a remnant of educated young black activists screaming to ears that have yet to be listened to.
Hi, my name is Lee.
Edward James. Jonathan Likes.
I'm Summer.
And my name's Justin.
My name is Camille.
Alexandra Moffat-Bateau.
Hi, I'm Cathy Cohen.
I'm 19 years old. I'm 19.
24 years old.
I am 17 years old.
I am a blogger.
I am a blogger.
The principal investigator.
I'm a poet. That's all you need to know. When I was 1 day old, my voice began to beat out into a cry. I would not be silent. I will be heard.
Wow, okay. How's everybody doing? You good? First of all, I want to thank the planners of this incredible conference for the invite to be on this incredible plenary. I'm sure, unless you're really hard of seeing, you know I'm not 19, like the folks on the video. I am a little older than 19, but as Dana would say, I think of myself as an activist, as an advocate. I get paid as an academic. But my commitment is, in fact, to kind of creating spaces, using power and leverage, right, to make sure that, in fact, young folks, and in particular young black people, have a space to speak for themselves. I should say, you know, I'm sure I'm here because, in fact, I'm the founder of the Black Youth Project, but everything that's really good about the Black Youth Project is about kind of young black people deciding, in fact, that they wanted to hold on to a project and build a project that would allow them to kind of speak for themselves, to engage and produce research that matters and that was accurate about who they were, and probably most importantly, to engage in political projects that was about kind of advancing their lives. So for me, having this discussion about kind of civic engagement and political engagement from on the basis or kind of in the lives of young black folks, for me, this is not a kind of an abstract proposition, right? I want to welcome you to the city of Chicago, but you know, we are in the city of Chicago, and I want to make sure I don't mess up the stats, just so you know, that on Monday of this week, Janila Watkins, a 6-month-old baby, was shot and killed while her father was changing her diaper in a parked van on 65th and Maryland, about 3 blocks from the University of Chicago. In January, 15-year-old Hadia Pendleton, whom you may have heard of, was shot and killed at a park about a mile from the president's house, 3 blocks from my house, after having performed 3 weeks prior at an event attached to the president's inauguration. In January, 42 people were killed by gun violence, mostly young people in the city of Chicago, the deadliest January we've seen in 11 years. Last year, 506 people were killed by gun violence in the city of Chicago, right? The truth is, of course, is that the majority of those young people were Black and Latino young people, right? And the good news, I guess, for us in thinking about kind of the political prospects of changing those numbers is that increasingly folks are using new media and digital media and social media to say, in fact, you know, that something has to be done, that this is a crisis. So we know who those young people are, and if you go to a website, danah2013.com, you can actually see pictures of these young people, right? This is a project that forces us to recognize who they are and that they won't be kind of made invisible. There are a number of online mapping programs that have been utilized to show the concentration of this type of loss on the south and west sides that are populated by Black and Latino folks, right? There are online projects and programs like the BYP, young brother on the south side, Bryant Cross, where people have kind of taken the initiative to say they were going to use new media to engage in campaigns to focus a response both from the president and from communities around the gun violence, right? So I think there is this moment where we have an opportunity to think about how new media might allow largely marginal folks, especially young folks of color, to have voice at some point, to make the nation or the city or this conference recognize and struggle with what it means to be safe, right? And so, my issue, we've already kind of gone back and forth on it. My issue with the It Gets Better campaign is it doesn't get better for everybody. Like, coming out doesn't make it better for everybody, right? If your school is failing, if you might get shot on the way to school, if you live in a food desert. So how do we complicate our understanding both of youth and the potential of the work that we can do, and how do we highlight in particular the voices of young folks of color, disaggregating this kind of massive thing that we call youth. The last thing I'll just say really quick, because I know we're only supposed to start. Take my time. Biko said, take my time. I think, as part of the MacArthur Network on Youth and Participatory Politics, which is an incredible group of people to work with, one of the things we're kind of struggling with is the difference between voice and power, right? And I think that new media in many ways opens up the opportunity for expression and voice. I think what Ethan talked about is kind of thin or symbolic, not to say that symbolic isn't critical or important, but I think we have to figure out what is the infrastructure that moves expression and voice to real power, right? The power to transform folks' lives. And not every project is about transforming lives in the real sense of the word or phrase, but for some folks and for some folks of color, that's what it has to be about, right? It is not an abstract principle about participating in a democratic process. It's about, am I going to live and will my communities be viable? So I think there are just incredible opportunities and questions before us. It's really exciting to be in this room, and I know we're going to have an incredible conversation. Biko.
How you guys doing? All right, I'm the hip hop dude up here, so always got call and response. How's everyone doing?
Hey.
Thank you. My name is Biko Baker. I'm the executive director of the League of Young Voters, and I'm excited to be here. I want to shout out to the panel organizers, especially Dr. Watkins for having me. It's cool. I really appreciate it. We have a same friend who sort of connected us, so I appreciate being here. The League is a youth-driven organization. Well, we have leaders in California, Texas, Georgia, Maine, Ohio, and Wisconsin. And I always tell people this because I get in trouble. Even sometimes my team gets mad at me. But Wisconsin is my home, and it's also my learning lab. Milwaukee is one of the youngest and blackest communities in the country, and I've had the privilege of spending the last 8 to 10 years learning on how to get young people, especially young black people, excited in the civic process. And so I'm going to take you on a path with me, all right? Quick story. Raise your hand if you know anybody that's been in jail or is currently in jail. All right, put them down. Raise your hand if you know anybody that's been murdered. Okay, so it's fewer. For years, my organization has been doing this sort of quick exercise or spectrogram just to get a clear sense of where people are at in our trainings. And when we do this with young people of color, young black and brown youth, almost 100% of the times, both hands, they just stay up. And it's pretty sad. And as we got better at the training, we traveled more, and whether it was in Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, Detroit, Oakland, Chicago, young black youth always raised their hand. And after years of doing these trainings, I started to get numb, not because I don't passionately believe in the young people that we're working with, but because it started to be overwhelming that our community had seen so much death and pain, and no one was dealing with it legislatively. So around 2006, the young leaders in my community started to get more actively involved in the civic process. We realized that the local political economy was being driven by the very pain and destruction that was getting young people in our programs to raise their hands. In fact, during his first campaign, our local district attorney told us that drugs and violence undergirded the local economy. In a very not so subtle but sympathetic way, he told us that the underground economy is holding up a number of sectors. So another exercise for you guys. You ready? Who do drug dealers make money off of? Community. All right. That's pretty much what the answer we get from, where we're from, they might call them hypes, crackheads. very demeaning terms for drug addicts. Who makes money off of drug dealers? Right? So, the man. Unfortunately, the man does, and if you pay attention, we take it deeper. Schools, doctors, policemen. There's a whole cottage industry based on the violence and destruction in our community. But I believe that things can change. Okay, one more thing. Where were you in your head? Where were you the night that Barack Obama was first elected? In the streets cheering. First in center, I don't know what he said, I just made that up. I remember that night vividly, not because of Barack's speech or because I thought we were about to have some wave of progression change in our communities, because at 1 a.m. on 27th and Center, in the heart of Milwaukee's most violent neighborhood, 40 young people were marching the streets with Barack Obama signs. I mean, on that very corner, we held marches and candlelight vigils and tried to encourage neighbors to stop violence, and 40 kids at 1 a.m. were marching and celebrating. Fundamentally, the young people on 27th and Center knew that they were powerful and their voice had meaning if used collectively. When we started organizing, we had an oppositional attitude when it came to politicians. We were tied to the us versus them narrative that elected officials were instinctively bad people. But since 2008, we have taken the stance that it is more important for us to go from opposition to proposition. For example, we recently teamed up with younger members of Milwaukee City Council to throw politics and poetry, a spoken word event in City Hall, which was tweeted and was trended locally. We also currently are working with the city to find ways to use technology to improve communication with the community. And we also are teaming up with the Department of Corrections to help them inform formerly incarcerated people that their rights to vote have been restored once they get off paper. And I can sit up here and tell you how we use all these tools. Everybody here knows the tools, but it's integrated and it's constant in our campaigns. And these propositional activities aren't being driven by me or a fancy corporate board, but the young leaders in our network who see themselves as change agents whose voices are powerful. In fact, last November, 87% of registered voters turned out to vote, and as I said before, Milwaukee is one of the youngest and brownest cities in the country. Okay, one last time. Raise your hand if you believe change is possible. Raise them up real high, raise them up real high. That's what's up. I absolutely believe that our communities can change, but we must work to transform the way our cities and neighborhoods work. As it stands, we are building institutions and organizational cultures that are destroying our youngest citizens. On one end, we have a narrative described by Michelle Alexander in her latest text, The New Jim Crow. We have created oppressive local political economies that are being driven by poverty, joblessness, and a stupid-ass war on drugs. And then the other, we have a narrative lifted up by Cathy Cohen in her book, Democracy Remixed, which points out that we have a generation of empowered, technologically savvy civic superheroes who believe that they can change the world. We must start letting young people fix the problems that we have created for them by letting them innovate, reshape, and remix the institutions that govern their lives. Once all of us have been able to go from opposition to proposition, we can truly transform and reshape our communities into the powerful juggernauts that they can be. But we have to do it now, and we can't wait. When we leave today, all of us must commit to giving young people a shot at making mistakes, learning, and improving their living conditions. We can do it if we do it now. Thank you.
So before Astrid, am I on? Am I on? Yeah, okay. So before Astrid speaks, I just wanted to, we got a video that we wanted to queue up for her as well. And she'll speak to this, but Astrid was at the center of arguably the biggest social and political earthquake of the last 2 to 3 years or so. And there's a rising influence and voice of young Latinos in this country, and in particular, young undocumented Latinos. And so they have sort of created this rallying cry, undocumented and unafraid. And the work that they've been doing at the grassroots level has been very impressive, very impactful. And as we think about what Cathy alluded to, this expression of voice and how that translates into real power, I think Astrid, her generation, and what they're standing up for is a pretty incredible sort of embodiment of that. And so we thought one of the ways that we might help orient you to Astrid's story is just to share with you really quickly, I think, a really nice and powerful clip.
Well, this is wonderful. Astrid has been a friend. It's been a friendship through trial and tribulation. That's what life is all about, and it seems the people you're the closest to are people that you've struggled with. And we've struggled. It hasn't always been an ace that we've drawn from that deck of cards. Sometimes we had a 2 or 3, but we played the cards that we were dealt. And I think we've done pretty well with that hand that we were dealt. We're not where we want to get, but we've made a lot of progress. And Astrid can come back here now and visit me and not be worried about somebody snatching her.
Home means Nevada, but definitely it's great to be here in the place that I had wanted to be for so long. Not only because it is our nation's capital, but because Senator Reid's here, and this is where dreams are going to become a reality.
Well, thank you. My name's Astrid Silva, and I guess the label that has followed me for a long time now has been Dreamer, which is what undocumented youth are called. I'm a part of an organization that we founded in 2011. It's called Dream Big Vegas. And I started out volunteering, at a progressive organization in Nevada called Progressive Leadership Alliance of Nevada. And that's kind of where we branched off and realized that there were so many more issues than just being undocumented that were affecting us, like LGBTQ dreamers who at that point weren't even going to benefit from any law that was passed with spouses. But I think the most important thing that we have done in our state is, I think that rallying cry of undocumented, unafraid has been really strong in other states. In other cities that were more established, but in our state it was really undocumented and please don't tell anybody. There wasn't any sort of unafraid or not living in fear. And for a long time in our state, since about 2005, 2006, when the big immigration rallies started and everything like that, there was never really anybody to speak up for us. Everybody else was giving us our voice. But nobody had really said that they were undocumented. In 2009, a group of us started to get involved, and none of us knew that the other one was undocumented. It was just sort of like, let's all just volunteer, because we really, politics, we knew that that was the only way to get it, and that's how I happened to meet Senator Harry Reid. And I was telling everybody earlier that my third grade teacher always said personal letters, handwritten, are the most important thing that you can do. And so I handed him a handwritten letter, and from then on, every single time he saw me, he would say, "Do you have my letter?" So I always had a letter written, telling him sort of what we were doing in our state, and every single time that something came up, that's how he would find out what the actual students felt about it. Because as he said, it's really easy for us to judge from an outside point of view and do what we think is best for you, but only you know what is best for your community. And ever since then, our name Dream Big comes from Senator Reid always telling us dream big at the end of our letters and things like that. And so now, our organization has been established for almost 2 years, and we've been able to not only guide students into what they can do, but give them that power to go ahead and share their stories. And when they're not ready to share their stories, help them so that one day they can be able to. Because if we pressure somebody, that won't be them getting their voice. That'll be us forcing it upon them. And we really think it's really important that every person comes out when they feel it's important and when they feel they're ready. And one of the most important things is that in Nevada, per capita, we have the highest Twitter users. And so Twitter, Facebook have been such great tools for us. Our state is really accessible, and we're a young state when it comes to politics and involvement. and our elected leaders have really responded well to it. Even those who are opposed to us, they sort of, they know that we're there and we're going to be ready to answer back and to anything that they have to say. And I think more than anything, we showed that in 2012, first in 2010 with the re-election of Senator Reid against a woman who was very anti-immigrant and very basically anything progressive. The Latino vote turned out in the highest rate they ever had. And then in 2012, the minority vote, the Latino vote included, was one of the highest ever. And I think we'll only continue to show in our state how that can change and how dreamers are going to continue to go out there and help our community vote. And hopefully one day we ourselves will be able to vote.
So I was reminded in our quick get-together right before our session to let you know that there will be time for questions and answers. So if you have questions, things that you would like to ask any of our plenary members here, please start queuing those up and thinking about them, because there will be an opportunity at the end to do that. So a lot of obviously really important themes and issues have just kind of emerged in terms of these intros. And I'd like to throw out a couple of things and just have each of you in your own respective ways sort of respond to them. And one is, I think the point, Dana, that you made is, so a lot of this conference is about empowering young people and sort of building the opportunities, the pathways that allow them to sort of express and find their civic voices, their sort of political selves. But to what extent do we think about what, if any, risks are associated with that, and what does it mean to become more visible in that way, and how do we begin to sort of grapple with some of those possible tensions there? And then this issue of voice and power, I think is really something that's important and a very powerful point, and I would love to hear more about how each of you think about that in terms of, because I think in many respects your work has certainly been important in terms of supporting young people's abilities to kind of find and articulate their voice. Then how does that translate into various forms and expressions of power at various kinds of levels?
So for me, I think hello? Okay. So for me, I think one of the most important things to keep in mind is the importance of networks. And you really hear it through each of the stories that come up here, which is that when young people are actually able to tap into and be a part of a network, not just as individual actors contributing to a collective voice, but as people who are part of a community where they can make difference, that's where you see a lot of the real resonant power come into play. And I think that, we often look to social media as the possibility of creating those networks at the same time that we encourage young people to never talk to strangers. And it's this interesting tension, because a lot of the kinds of civic or political actions that we want to engender really require young people to talk to strangers. They require them to appreciate that they're actually engaging on the same practice, that they're working towards the same goals, that they can be a part of a community that works together to achieve something large. And so I think that we really also have to grapple with this tension, because I think that we actually have to think through how to actually build meaningful, sustained networks. And that actually allows young people to feel as though they're part of something, and that provides a central force in which you can actually start to achieve different things. And that's where I'd also say the other flip side to it, which I'm very grateful to Cathy's point about voice and power, because I think it's really important to note that so much of what we talk about as activism involving technology is just make your voice more heard, right? Drown out other people in the attention economy. And yet we have to acknowledge that in this attention economy, it's not equal voice. Some people are heard a lot more than others. People with already existing privilege are heard much more. And as we think about the ways in which these technologies are being, utilized by corporate interests, we're seeing a real silencing of a lot of marginalized voices. So I want to sort of not assume that the technology creates this voice for everybody, but to really think then about what does power look like within a network society where there are all of these different kind of controls that are emerging. And I think that's something really to grapple with as a DML community.
You want us to go down? Okay. So let me say just a couple quick things. First is on the question of kind of empowering young people. I mean, I think one of the things that the Youth and Participatory Politics Network, it's not our official title, struggles with, is really thinking about kind of the ways in which young people, in fact, are empowered by giving them voice, right? I don't want to minimize the importance of communities that have largely been made to be silent, finding places and platforms where, in fact, I keep talking about they, in fact, can speak for themselves. I think the other thing that we are kind of learning through the framework of participatory politics is that young people are also imagining politics in different ways, right? That they are pushing back on the boundaries of a traditional institutional politics and instead understanding kind of the targets of their focus to be oftentimes providing information, creating new media that gets disseminated among their own networks, right? So there's a way in which, in fact, that empowerment also envisions and creates a different sort of politics. So I think that, in fact, is to be embraced and applauded. I think the other thing, though, that the network really tries to think about is if, in fact, in the end, how one secures the things that are important to you requires a certain form of traditional political power, then how does a participatory politics relate to traditional power? And that is this question of kind of voice and power, and where, in fact, we understand participatory politics, voice, and its relationship to power. Now, on that point, I would say, and I think I would agree with Danah, that I think the most effective examples are where young people are utilizing kind of, as Joe would say, the affordances, Joe Kahn, the affordances of new media, but are also rooted in an infrastructure that allows them a kind of sustained engagement with the political domain. And so part of that infrastructure may look like networks, it may look like organizations like the League, but I think if we don't have a kind of broader framework for understanding the political and civic power of young people that includes new media, but also has to be based in a larger infrastructure, and sometimes we call it social movements, sometimes it looks a little different, then I think we might miss this opportunity to really allow young people to kind of leverage their expertise in a way that we haven't seen. And the last thing I'll say is kind of in traditional spaces of politics, expertise is thought to be equated with often age and experience. And one of the amazing things about new media is that that's a space where young people actually have expertise and more knowledge. And that becomes a place that I think we have to invest in and build. So.
Well, I just have a quick story. We were in the basement at the University of Chicago days after Adia Pendleton had been murdered. And it was a couple, it was a network, me, Bakari Kitchwana, Lisa Fager, some Black Youth Project staff. And before a meeting, all of us just started chopping it up. Cathy and the team had put a petition out, and then she said, tweet. And the next thing you know, some of us started tweeting, and the goal was to get Barack Obama home just symbolically, and then maybe to put some pressure on him to raise up the violence as a narrative that we need to be talking about. And then within a couple of weeks, 45,000 people?
49.
49,000 people had tweeted, signed the petition. Washington Post columnist wrote a story about it, got into the Washington news cycle. And then, 3 weeks later, Barack Obama is in Chicago addressing Cathy Cohen's students. This is powerful. I've been dealing with gun issues, since the Wisconsin chapter was started as the Campaign Against Violence. We felt nobody would ever listen to us. And here we are 6 years later having the president in Chicago in a private meeting talking with young black kids about violence. Would not have happened without the power of the internet, and it wouldn't have happened without the power of Twitter. However, I would say that if we don't collectively work together on the same voice and message on the same frame, it doesn't matter. It's only when we work and aggregate our power together that we're able to bring both voice and participation together.
Again, to us, the most important thing that we've been using is social media. I can say in 2011, my dad was actually up for deportation because of a fraudulent lawyer that he didn't even know about, but I just showed up at our house and arrested him. And within a day of that, we had about 1,100 petitions ready to go and to get him out of it being in an ICE holding. And without social media, without being able to have those connections within our state and outside of our state, there would have been no way that would have been able to happen. And now so many dreamers are using petitions and these things to save their families, because we know that if nobody outside our community knows what's happening to us, nobody's going to ever find out of how this happens every single day. And that again goes back to giving us our voice, where we appreciate the help from everybody else, but sometimes there are only things that only you can say through yourself that nobody else might know. And I think the most important thing for us has been that we're realizing that our leaders have flaws, they're human beings, and instead of being judged on that or going against it, I think we're using it to an advantage and saying, there's a little piece of this person that might come towards our legislation, because I know that in our state we have very, very conservative congressmen and senators, and right now we're trying to use so much of our stories in order for them to say, you had a mother, you have kids, and at any point we can be separated from our parents. Do you understand that this could happen to you if you were undocumented? And I think that it's really important that our leaders see that, and particularly with our situation, but obviously that goes with anything else, that sometimes we forget that because we've lived our stories, we assume everybody understands the same, we use different words, we use different messaging, but I think we sometimes forget that those leaders sometimes have lived outside of our bubbles, and that's why it's really important to get to them through any way possible, and right now social media has been that tool.
Astrid, one of the things you mentioned when we were talking earlier is this tension between young people using social media to really get their voice out there and the challenges of actually being visible and the cost that had in their personal lives. I'm curious how you advise or work with young people who are really dealing with that, and what it means to deal with neighbors who hate them, or these kinds of things that you were talking about.
Well, like I said, for us, until somebody is ready to share their story, we try and give them as much help and training as possible, because we know that there's people out there that there's no way you're going to sway them. They're going to continue calling us terrible names. They're going to continue saying things that we know may not be true, but when you're 16 and somebody's telling you that you shouldn't have been born because you're undocumented, those are things that we really try to talk to them about. And that's why I think that outside of our state, there's so many students that are coming out now because they're finding the courage in their community. Our community is still really small, even though we have our state is so large geographically, but really we have 2 major cities, and that's it. And so we have one newspaper. The rest are small printed, weeklies. So it's really important for us to make sure that these students know that when they share their story, there's a possibility that their neighbor is going to find out who they are, that the guy at the grocery store is going to find out who they are, because there's not that sense of anonymity, I can't say it, of being anonymous anymore. And it's really important that for us, we give them those tools to be able to go ahead and say, eventually this is going to come out, and we've seen that it helps families more than it harms them, and it's really important for them to see that at the end of the day we're trying to save all our families, but we can only do that if we know that they exist.
Can I feel like the need to clarify a few things about our change.org thing that happened. So someone said Barack Obama came and talked to us. There were like 700 other people in the room. I know he was really just talking to us, but, and I know, and no, I appreciate that. I mean, actually there were all these elected officials down low, and we were up in the bleachers, and I've said like all the young people except from the Black Youth Project were in uniform, because the kids from the schools had on uniforms, and the young people ushering folks in were from the ROTC, right? So it's like all these young Black people in uniforms, the president, and a bunch of elected officials. The second thing I would say is, that type of mobilization was really interesting, because in many ways it spoke to what young folks can do using Twitter and Facebook, and what happened in that basement, as Biko says. But it also speaks to, I would argue, kind of a new elite, because when we put this petition up on change.org and we started to get some flow from people tweeting about it, there was a moment when change.org contacted us and said, hey, we like your petition, so we can help you. And what they do is they have a database of about 1 million people, and they test out messages right? They do an A/B testing, and they figure out what's the best message, and then they send that message to their database. And we stopped at 49,000 because the president said he was coming. I am absolutely sure through change.org, we could have gotten 100,000 plus, right? So it is complicated for us to think about what we did, what young people did, and what this kind of new online infrastructure or kind of elite system based in change.org did in terms of picking and choosing which types of events would be, or which types of campaigns would be successful.
So yesterday during his keynote, Ethan, he gave this really sort of interesting kind of model, and he kind of just displayed this matrix of what he called kind of thick and thin political and social engagement, civic engagement, and then also the symbolic and the impactful. And I wonder, as you kind of think about your own particular spaces, and I think you each have very unique investments in this issue kind of more broadly. Have kind of, if it's the digital lives of kids and how they're beginning to navigate their identities and what it means to be public-private, and how for a lot of schools and a lot of families, as you know, that's become a really important issue in terms of young people's migration into the digital world as citizens and what that means. And then thinking about certainly, your work, Astrid, in terms of how that's beginning to sort of move up this ladder that Ethan talks about in terms of beginning to have some pretty substantive influence in terms of engagement with people like Harry Reid. I know after his success, Barack Obama's team made a very strong presence and pitch in your state, sort of recognizing the force of what you and others were doing on the ground. And I'm wondering where each of you see your own kind of alignment with some of the ideas that Ethan shared yesterday in terms of thin and thick, in terms of symbolic and impactful.
Want to start down there and come back?
Sorry. Definitely, we had an OFA presence in our state for every other week because we were such a important battleground state, and I can say that even since 2010, that's why it was so important for us, because we had started our infrastructure for undocumented youth since 2009, and that's how we were able to have all these students participating. And with the thick and thin, I think, there's so many students that maybe they weren't willing to come out and say, I'm undocumented, but they were saying we're allies. And that helped so much because we had so many students out there knocking on doors and helping elected officials that went with our ideas. It wasn't necessarily, obviously it did lean more towards a party, but it wasn't because of that. It was because the students were going for who they felt was going to help them more. And once that infrastructure was established by 2012, when the entire campaign started and there was more involvement, now there were more students that were ready to come out, and not only come out and knock on doors, but say, this is why I'm supporting this person, or this is why why I feel more important. We had a really important race, which was for Congressional District 4, and we had one of the candidates had in 2010, when he ran before that, he had said that if an illegal immigrant goes to the hospital, they should be deported on the spot. And, in 2 years, he had changed his entire tune, and immigrants are a great piece of our fabric of our country, and we were really strong in coming out and saying, no, we cannot forget that 2 years ago, this is what you were saying. And so that's why I was really, we came back, and in Nevada, it's not a parents vote and then kids vote what parents vote. It's the other way around. Our youth is the one encouraging our older generations to go out and vote, and where the youth is based is where the vote goes. And so we started to see more and more push for it, and with the whole institution of us trying to break in, there was a lot of times when people were just like, it's those kids, they can't even vote. Why should we even care about them? And this was mostly from opposition, trying to say that we didn't matter. And yet, with this candidate, we stood outside. He wouldn't make events. And we stood outside an event, until he was able to talk to us. And of course, he ran away from us. And you know, we were able to capture that and say, why aren't you answering our questions? And to him, we were just crazy kids. It aired that night because we sent our video into the media. And once it aired that night, his percentages dropped drastically. And I think that's when they realized we may just be these crazy kids that are standing outside, but these crazy kids are going out there and they're the ones talking to people.
That thin and thick metaphor, that's deep. And I wish I was here to hear Ethan's keynote, because it seems like something that I would have been wrestling with. I do know that thin or thick, there's nothing you can do, because young people of color, from our perspective, are growing at such an alarming, I'm excited about it, but such a large and exponential rate that all of us know that young people and people of color will be a majority in our lifetime. And whereas I think that's exciting and cool as hell, there are those that are so afraid of this that they keep coming up with these voter suppression laws. So even if young people are getting active and being involved, there's still a possibility that their activism will be limited and may thin. And so we have to look at these laws that are being passed as a fight against the future. And I encourage you, you might be like, how does anybody not have an ID in these days? Come holler at me afterwards. We can have a conversation about why so many people don't have IDs. But we do know that these laws they don't prevent people from voting illegally, because nobody's voting illegally anyway. And so I just encourage folks to think about the ways that we can support progressive structures and ideas to make sure that everybody is participating. Because I believe, and the league's theory of change is once young people believe that they can become stakeholders in society, they can do a lot of things. The league has had young people go on to run for office, take jobs in the administration, go on to start music companies. And they will tell you, and you can go on my Facebook page and see it, their big change for them has been an opportunity just to make mistakes. And so I encourage us, again, just to keep letting young people make mistakes and get involved.
So I'll just say, Ethan is brilliant, and I'm thrilled that he's on the network with us. But I guess in a way that I would have also said probably the significance of impactful. The dichotomy between symbolic and impactful, right, I feel like kind of has to be troubled. If we, and I know he would also. If we think about, for example, something outside the digital arena, even though it might not be, something like voting, as Biko was talking about, we know that more young folks of color and more black youth voted in 2008 and 2012. They voted at higher rates than any group of young people ever in the history of young people voting, right? Ever. And that was in part about kind of the symbolic significance of the first African-American president, and even in 2012, of the symbolic importance of wanting to support Barack Obama. Now, when you talk to these young people, which we have, I know, and done focus groups, they are clear about the limits to what has been produced to change their lives. But they hold on to the kind of symbolism and importance of Obama in their lives. And I have to think that turnout is also impactful. So we might think about kind of symbols as a pathway to, I guess, what we're calling impactful, which is more traditional institutional politics. But if, in fact, a symbolic engagement changes consciousness, if symbolic engagement provides an opportunity for success, we know in social movement theory, for example, that if you have a win, if you participate, if you become embedded in networks, you're more likely to do that type of work that's impactful. So I think the types of programs and opportunities, platforms that we're building at times might look only symbolic, but I think at some place they have to also lead to and be mindful of how symbolism is a pathway to, I guess, this thing we're calling impactful, and is actually impactful in terms of people's consciousness and commitment to a politics. So.
There was a third axis that Ethan raised, that he talked about it in terms of scalability. But I actually want to sort of challenge and complicate that notion, because a lot of what we're talking about as we talk about these axes of impact, or these ideas of what it creates to do social movement building, have to do with the ability to actually involve either lots of people or figure out how to engage and make impact on very privileged populations. As these tensions that often emerge with a lot of different kinds of social movement organizing, right, which is a lot of it when you're dealing with marginalized populations is often about how do you get as many people out there and engaged as possible, because scale is one of the ways to trump structures of privilege. But there are other things that emerge, and we see a lot of activism that emerges that has to do with having real connections and meaningful access to powerful entities, whether we're talking about elected officials or whether we're talking about people who have economic privilege or social status. And I think these tensions become really difficult when you start to see the ways in which movement organizing is possible in a networked era. And I say this, and I can't help but thinking, in light of a situation that I've been grappling with for the last couple of months. So 2 months ago, a friend of mine died by suicide. And it's been a pretty intense process to go through this, because there's been an amazing amount of activism around his death. He was an activist, and he was very much dealing with a lot of abuse by the state in very particular ways. And in trying to publicly mourn and make sense of this, I ended up receiving a lot of critique from the public. And one of the criticisms I received over and over again was like, why can you stand up for him and his voice when people of color die all the time because of abuse by the state? And on one hand, I totally agree. Like, that's something I live with all the time, is the abuse of the state over and over again for a whole lot of people. And one of the challenges with my friend is that he was extremely privileged. He was extremely well networked to extraordinarily privileged people, many of whom are in this room. He had access to a lot of people who, in many ways, controlled the networks and were able to make a lot of attention emerge after his death. And there's a lot of political activism, much of which is deeply needed, because the regulation that was was being used to go after him was absolutely horrifying. But I struggle with this, philosophically as well, because I don't see the same kind of activism that emerges when a young person of color is the one that's being oppressed over and over again by the state. And so we can talk about these things and we can build these massive networks, but how do we also talk about these moments of very local networks for less privileged populations? And that challenge of scale to me becomes really important, because I don't want it to just be a numbers game of how many people can get killed in Chicago before we'll actually take action, or what happens when it's one symbolic, perfect case. That's scary to me. How do we actually build a kind of activism, a kind of movement that recognizes that we're dealing with deep structural inequities, and that we're talking about people's lives, whether they're privileged populations or less privileged populations? And this is what I hope with a lot of these technologies, that we don't just move into a game of numbers or a game of symbolism, but figure out actually how to respect and recognize people for where they're at, regardless of how privileged they are to begin with.
Can I touch a little on that? Within the Dreamer movement, even there's so many, where there are many of us who are privileged. I grew up in a family with 2 loving parents, open to anything, and they try to give me the best life. But we know that there's so many students out there who had to work, who had to sustain their family, who had to, I've never driven in my life, but I know that there's so many students that had to drive to get themselves to their work and from. And those are the kids that have those tickets for not having a driver's license and for, doing what they needed to do. And even within that, this sort of institution does try to divide us and say, these are the good dreamers and these are the good kids who are going to get their documents, and the rest of you who drove without a license, or who aren't from backgrounds that we necessarily agree with, or even that are LGBTQ, you guys are in this other category. And to us, that's obviously something that we're trying to move away from, and especially now that we are focusing more on entire federal immigration reform. But there are those categories of where they try and say, these are the good kids, and these are the sort of, they grew up on the wrong side of the tracks kids. And that's something that we all need to continue to move away from, especially in social media, where, now it's like, you hashtag dreamer, and to that's somebody who's, you know, going to graduate high school or graduated college. Nevada has the highest dropout rate in the country, unfortunately. And now that we're filling out deferred action forms, while helping kids to do them, we're finding out that in our state, so many of these kids had certificates of completion, which meant that they were just basically passed on through the system. And then when they graduated, these kids are so proud, and their moms have them in frames, and they come in and they have them. All it means is that they went to school. It doesn't mean they ever really fully got enough credits. And so now these kids are finding out that, you know, something they've had on their wall isn't really a diploma. And now those kids are sort of being cast aside and said, well, until you finish your entire education, then you can apply for this benefit to not get deported from the country you know.
I think that's a very powerful point, and something that I think connects in some really important ways with the DML community. And so much of what I hear from you and how we thought about this is that, you know, this is a struggle on many different levels for many different things. And as we think about literacy, as we think about education, and think of those as sources and pathways to various forms of empowerment and expressions of that, I'm really struck by that example, because I think in so many respects, the struggle that you and other dreamers have been a part of is not simply about politics and senators, but it's also about what's happening in people's everyday lives, the quality of education that they have or don't have access to, and how critically important those are to really enhancing and providing opportunities for young people. So I know it's really important to the panelists here to take questions, and I think we have mics. Yes, we do have mics, and it's hard for us to see, and we'll do a good job of trying to identify you. But please come forward if you have any questions for the panelists, any reactions to what you've heard, thoughts, perspectives, just to add to this conversation. We'd very much appreciate the opportunity to have that time with you.
Come on, no questions?
No questions.
We see some people making their way to the mics. Go ahead, right here.
Hi, my name is Will. I had a question for Danah. You mentioned, just kind of glanced by, a disparity between people who create media with thick intentions that's treated in a thin way. I think that often happens in situations where the medium is like short, like in YouTube comments, or vice versa even, where it's a thin intention, but if you've made the video, it's treated as very significant to the person. I wondered if you could elaborate more on how you see that.
Sure. I think part of what I was trying to get or deal with is the fact that, you know, take the videos that young people make, or they'll make a remix video, they'll really think, and they'll put a lot of time, effort into creating something that's really powerful, important to them. And it turns out to be a 2-minute video that people sort of look at and read and watch within a collection of a large number of other things. So what happens is that it ends up being a thick level of participation, a thick level of like involvement by the individual, and so it creates this powerful moment for the individual creating it. But then when viewed as a part of a whole slew of things, it might as well just be another dot in the numbers. And I think that's actually where there's this interesting tension that emerges when we think about what happens with social media and the dynamics around aggregation. Right, when the focus becomes on aggregation, and we literally hear it, this many videos were made in response to X, right? And then we count the numbers as opposed to, oh my gosh, all of these people spent so much time, passion, sweat, tears to participate. And it's also all of these ways in which, how do we even think about participation? Because so much of it becomes numeracy. So much of it becomes what counts and how many counts we start to pay attention to, and who gets to measure their activism in particular ways. And I think this is one of the costs of a lot of, you know, nonprofits having to justify their actions to funders, or, you know, all of these other kinds of dynamics around this. And that's why I'm saying that thick-thin becomes a lot about where your position is in relation to the action. So that it could be a thick participation by the individual, but thin as it's interpreted by the ecosystem.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so we're going to just restrict to one question. And
we can talk more afterwards.
Okay.
Hi, I work at a public library on Long Island, which many of you probably know is that red tail coming out of Blue State, New York. And a lot of the young people I work with are conservative. They were raised conservative, they're anti-gun control, they're anti-marriage rights, they're anti-reproductive rights for young women, et cetera, et cetera. I love these kids. I work with these kids. I believe their voices are valid. But how do you balance a progressive viewpoint with wanting to make sure that young people who might not share, have those same progressive beliefs? There's a question there. But
well, I'm a.
Sorry.
I believe in democracy. I believe that democracy is powerful. I feel like we shouldn't shut it out because, unfortunately, when we try to do that, they'll come with even more oppressive things. But I grew up in the most segregated city in America by the 2010 census. My parents loved them to death, but they sent me to a private Lutheran high school. And every day I get on Facebook and try to create messages for my high school friends just to anger them. But I know I'm winning because there's friends like I've gotten out behind the filter bubble. People are not even my friends who I don't want to like, they won't like me, will comment on our stuff. We just have to go out and organize. Chances are these kids haven't left Long Island, and if we're able to connect them to a bigger world through the internet or through just getting on a train, we can change them around. I believe that my goal over the next 2 years is to organize with conservative white folks or people of color because I believe that they can be turned over, they can be switched, just as young people of color used to be all the homophobic stuff. And I've seen in practical examples over the last 2 or 3 to 4 years how the hip-hop generation has become more progressive.
I agree with Biko, but I guess I want to have, I want to protect the place for those young people to have thought about these issues and take a different stance on these issues than we do. I mean, I don't know what I can guess maybe what the politics of the room generally are. Yeah. But I don't want to problematize these young folks because, in fact, they have conservative views. So I guess maybe I'm a little lost. I think the issue for me is on both sides, if there's a kind of clear side, to what degree young folks through new media are being exposed to individuals who think differently about issues, right? And I think there are some folks on the left who are very content to be in what we might call echo chambers without really kind of struggling with how other people understand the world and why they understand the world from that perspective. So that becomes the bigger crisis, I guess, for democracy for me than just that they're conservative.
I just want to jump in here because I'm actually really fascinated by the segmentations that's happened around viewpoints, and we see a political segregation that emerges around whether people consume conservative or liberal or progressive content. Two of my colleagues at Microsoft Research have been really analyzing this. This is Elad Yom Tov and Sue DeMay. And one of the things, they see a complete segregation in what people consume, and they see that if content is produced, given to them that results in being a different viewpoint, they won't consume it. But they learned a really interesting trick, and it's part of the things that we're experimenting with as a lab right now. They found that if you present content to somebody, like let's say you've got a progressive and you want them to hear the conservative point of view, if you present them in Glenn Beck style, they won't listen to it. But if you present it to them in a linguistic style that is familiar to the progressive way of speaking, but using conservative content, they'll actually begin to hear it, and vice versa. So one of the things I would actually charge all of you who are making media to think about is what is the stylistic decisions that you're making that end up fitting with your political ideologies, and how much do you try to shove not just your views, but also your way of speaking down people's throats? And imagine if you take a moment and tried to produce content that was actually stylistically from a different frame, but maybe providing the content or the complexity from your own point of view, and really mess that up. So there's a lot of experimentation happening. I'm happy to point you to the scholars that are working on it, but it's one of the ways of trying to get people to hear different sides, because that's one of the things we're really missing in this space.
A really quick point on it is that this is youth, but in our community, and especially in the Latino community, they tend to be a lot more conservative, especially regarding LGBTQ and women's rights. They might be 100% with us on immigration, but on the other two. And what we found really is starting to work is to say, you cannot be asking for rights for this one issue and then leave everything else kind of hanging. And we've seen that a lot of the older, the very engraved, very religious people are starting to say, you're right. If I don't care what one person's doing, then there shouldn't be a reason for me to meddle in somebody else's business. And that's what we've been playing to. And like I said, and with us, it's the youth that is more progressive. But I think that can apply in any case because we're sharing our stories with them, whether it be on being LGBT, on being undocumented, on any issue. And once you share the story, I think sometimes we forget and we sort of put this big bad face on somebody and we forget that they're humans too and that if you speak to them in a manner that isn't going to be threatening or that isn't, this is my stance, this is your stance, we've drawn a line, there can be a lot of work to be done there.
Yes, my name is Ime Alaquiva. I'm Executive Director of Hip Hop on Lock, an arts education program out of Pittsburgh. And we use a lot of creative media and a lot of innovative ways to really tap into our young people. But gun violence is a very serious issue in Pittsburgh that we try to decorate. But it seems as though when we try to decorate that subject matter, a lot of people are warm and fuzzy at first, but they tend to sort of separate themselves of the gun violence issue, of course, and not unless it's around political time for mayors to get reelected and things of that nature. Biko, specifically, what are some of the creative measures that you suggest that we can sort of close the gap on, that warm and fuzzy versus reality and keeping it real with our young people?
Woo, that's the $1 million question. What part of Pittsburgh are you from?
Oakland area,
Okay, yeah, no. Pittsburgh is a very near and dear town just because of the folks from One Hood, just Syriacs and the League had a very strong chapter there. I definitely think we need to have people push for the responsible gun ownership bill, but I think the struggle is unless we come at the gun problem holistically, we'll miss it. There's been times where I don't own a gun, but this last week there was an incident where I was like, man, maybe I need to have a gun, and we have to deal with the fact that our young people are dealing with post-traumatic stress in the same way that police that deal with police brutality are dealing with post-traumatic stress, as many of them come from the military and no one has dealt with their pain. I think we have to come up with smart gun laws and at the same time deal with the heart space and give people hugs and let them know that it's all right that they feel, incredible pain. In terms of elected officials, you just got to stay in their face, and I find that Facebook and Twitter, because all of my elected officials are on Facebook and Twitter, just tag them, keep tagging them, promote your picture after you've tagged them, and eventually I'm telling you, I had a story where I was at a bar, and the mayor's assistant came up to me, he's like, I know you, you're Biko Baker. I was like, whoa, that means the mayor must be talking about me because of all the stuff I've been tagging him on Facebook, so just keep doing it.
Okay, here.
Thank you all. This is my first DML, and I've been talking with different people throughout the last day or so about what happens after the conference is over. I've talked with people who are doing all sorts of digital media and youth media work all over the country and all over the world, and I'm curious about how to make something sustainable and how to make something wider that will continue on outside of this wonderful space where all these people are working on interesting things. This is for anyone on the...
One of the things that I've always enjoyed about DML is sort of precisely related to that question. So maybe you already have had the opportunity to, if it's various panels or chances to meet and have conversations with people, but the truth is a lot of people sitting out there are doing this work and doing work like it. And so my sense is that there's always an opportunity to sort of learn more about what people are doing, to try to connect your efforts and interests with that. And so we don't see this as just a conversation that stops here. In fact, there are things that are already happening before people arrive here, things that people will be doing when they leave here. And so it's our sense that there's a lot of activity, there's a lot of movement building, there's a lot of institutional work in local communities. And so these aren't conversations that we have just for the sake of having conversations. I think people really leave here with new ideas, thinking about new platforms, new modes of intervention, new sense of agency. And so I would encourage you, just to have conversations with people. There are workshops where people are actually demonstrating, kind of putting on display the work that they're doing, the ideas that they're putting into action. And so this is really, I think, kind of an action-oriented kind of space and conversation that we try to facilitate here.
Hi, Mimi Ito, UC Irvine. I really appreciated Dana's pointing out, the differential power in different social networks. They're not all created equal, and when we talk about numbers, we really also have to talk about privilege within the same breath. Sort of jumping off from that, I really wanted to say, okay, so what do we do with that insight? My intuition is that there's sort of a special moment when networks of differential power overlap and unite to do things together, that there's a level of strategic thinking that we can do to unite sort of the numbers game with the differential privilege sort of metrics in ways that can be very intentional and effective when done right. I know that sounds pretty abstract, but for any of the panelists, I'm really curious if you have a very concrete example of a strategy for how to deal with differential power in different social networks, how to bridge or connect that, either as a strategy or as an example of it actually working.
So for me, I have a sick and twisted social engineering love about some of these issues, because I actually think that you can engineer situations in which people connect across privilege lines in ways that are extraordinarily powerful. And the weird thing is that we had two historical environments where that actually happened for young people that in many ways we've actually slowly dissolved. The first is actually the military, which actually historically was a way for people to connect across privilege and difference lines that was extremely important. And as we've shifted and privatized huge chunks of our military, we have lost some of that. The second historically was more elite institutions, and it didn't work across all spectra, but it was really interesting about how colleges, for example, would social engineer people to live together or be exposed to people so that they actually were making connections across lines of privilege. The reason I point these out is we're dissolving them for different reasons. What I'd say back to, especially the activists in the room, when are there moments where you can get people who are at different levels of privilege to build friendships because they're actually stuck in a situation that they are really frustrated by together? Because when they're really frustrated, they bond. And that's actually a really important process, and it's one of the reasons why military and dorms are actually both very powerful, because it's really frustrating. So how do you actually design situations where it's not just people coming together kumbaya style, but coming together having a similar frustration with some other entity where they're trying to make that change and find ways to connect them? And I think that we should also think about where we build institutions and where we build opportunities for people to connect, and really consciously think that through as a part of our activism, because I think building those networks is really where we're going to start to see some of this change happen.
So can I just jump on that really quickly also? Because I think first of all, kind of understanding the multiplicity of identities and social positions that allow for differential privilege is really important. So I think, for example, if we disaggregate or think through what we mean by young black people, one of the things we've seen, for example, with the Black Youth Project is that there are some young black people who are at the University of Chicago and at Northwestern. There are other young folks who are at really kind of failing high schools, but there is a kind of unified, first of all, culture around hip hop, also kind of the experience of kind of transitioning mobility. So folks who now have some access to privilege through their universities used to come from different types of neighborhoods, right? So we don't understand that privilege as static. And so I think that allows for us to kind of even kind of think through where we think we see kind of homogenous groups, the different ways in which people have access to power and what they're bringing to the table to work across those different communities and different networks. So.
Okay, so unfortunately, we're getting the cut it off signal, and so we have to cut it off. And feel free, please, to come up and ask questions individually here with members of the plenary. Before we close, we have one final announcement and opportunity we'd actually like to share with you. And this may be kind of a direct response to your question about how do we continue this conversation, how do we continue some of this work. We'd like to tell you about an exciting opportunity you can share with your networks. The Illinois Humanities Council, with support from the MacArthur Foundation, is sponsoring a nationwide digital media competition called Looking at Democracy. The purpose is for participants to generate short, provocative digital media content designed to spark a conversation about how we can strengthen American democracy. There's a total of about $100,000 in prize money in 5 categories that will be rewarded after the April 30th deadline. The Illinois Humanities Council and the MacArthur Foundation want to thank those organizations here at the conference that have already joined as partners to help promote this effort. If you want to learn more, you can visit www.lookingatdemocracy.org, and we also have a short video that we wanted to share with you. Okay, thank you, and thank our panelists.